So our next speaker is Alice Zheng, a women's health practice leader and engagement manager at McKinsey in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and global public health practices. She leads women's health efforts at the firm, including internal research on the industry subsegments such as femtech and pharma. Previous to McKinsey, she worked in women's health as a clinician and also as a public health practitioner in reproductive health in East Africa and Asia. Alice holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and an MD MPH from the University of Michigan Medical School and the School of Public Health. Alice, we'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. This is the third HIT Lab Women's Health event, and I'm thankful that I've participated in the previous ones as well, and really excited to be here. I was going to introduce myself, but I think Sophia just did a great job of that. One thing I'll add is this is one of my favorite topics. Really excited to talk about all things related to women's health, and it's also deeply personal for me as well. Beyond the professional aspects of having worked in clinical medicine and public health, women's health is personal for me. Have had the fertility experience myself, and I am currently 36.5 weeks pregnant, and so very much living through the experience of many elements. And one thing I wanted to say is that I'm so glad that this event is continuing. In the past year and a half, 2 years, there's been many familiar faces. Folks that women's health overall. It means different things to different people, and I think it would be helpful just to start with a little bit of an overview of what are the different components. And what's exciting is that the finalists that are pitching cover different areas within that. And then also spend a little time talking about female entrepreneurship, since it's very much an adjacent topic to what's happening. Next slide. Great. Can actually go to the next slide. Great. So when we think about women's health, there's a lot of different components. There's one side of the story is around what are conditions that affect women primarily. A lot of this might be around contraception, gynecology, fertility is a big topic, maternal health, etc. And when we think about this segment, there's a lot of unmet need. We know that in the US, maternal mortality is actually increasing, which is concerning, especially compared to our peer countries in Europe, where maternal mortality ratios have been decreasing, in fact. And on the other hand, there's also diseases that affect women that are not specific only to women, but there's something happening such that is disproportionate. So such as autoimmune diseases, or it affects women differently. And the question here is, do we fully understand why in a way that we can more appropriately treat women? Since a lot of landmark clinical trials and our understanding of medicine is actually based on what we know about the male physiology. And I'm also excited here because one of the finalists actually has a product that is directed towards this part of women's health, which is actually a bit harder to innovate on. And when we look at the landscape of innovations, it is a bit, there's less of it on general conditions that affect women differently. In terms of unmet need here, it's also significant, as just mentioned, in terms of, are we adequately represented in clinical trials? Are the results actually reported in a gender-specific way so that we understand how drugs, for example, and diseases affect women? So we can go on to the next slide. And just a deep dive into one part of women's health if we think about different industries. So one area I spend a lot of my time in at McKinsey is in the pharmaceutical industry. And a little while back, I was doing a project where we're looking at different levels of investment in terms of clinical pipeline. So these are pharmaceuticals that are being tested for different diseases. And what's interesting is if you look across all the different disease areas and how many pipeline products there are, there's about 5 to 6% total that's in women's health, but most of that's actually in oncology. So when you look at everything else that affects, half the population, from maternal health issues to contraception to fertility, it makes up 1 to 2% of the pipeline. And so this is an area that is not getting a lot of attention from the pharmaceutical sector. You can go to the next slide. And of course, there are a couple of leaders in this space who really are doubling down and investing here. There are biotechs that are spending time, but when we look at the broader sector, it is not a space that has a lot of innovation. Which turns me to the next industry, if we think about, if we look at it broadly, which is consumer-facing companies and femtech, which is a buzzword that I'm sure everyone here has heard by now many times. And what's exciting to me is that even though we don't see a lot of innovation for women's conditions and diseases from the pharmaceutical sector, at least not across the whole industry, that there's this burgeoning sector that's being called femtech. And again, many of the finalists today are also in that space, as well as a lot of the names that I see in the attendee list. And this to me is very exciting. There's a lot of different ways in which confluences of female entrepreneurship, more female-focused VCs, and destigmatization of women's health topics have allowed for this to bloom. Next slide. And when we did a little landscaping to look at what are these types of companies doing? What's special about the trends that they are now enabling, and in a bit of a landscape. And so when we looked across this, we did this last year. We looked at 300 companies that could be classified as femtech. And what we saw is that they're doing a lot of really exciting things. So one is in terms of care delivery and how women are receiving care. There's this push to disrupt the current paradigm, to make things more female-centric, to enable telemedicine, remote services, to make it even more convenient for the patient. And I know that also, again, the finalists and attendees today are very much in this space in terms of let's disrupt the status quo and really design things in a way that are better for the women and the patients. The second area that we see in terms of a macro trend is really allowing women to take charge of their own health. So in the past, where you might have to, make an appointment with a physician, you might be a long wait. You have to take some time off of your day to go get your contraceptive. Well, now there's solutions for contraceptives, for diagnostics, where it used to be a gatekeeper, where now women can actually take charge of their health. It doesn't mean that there's no clinical care now. It just transformed in a way that allows women to take more charge of when and how they get some of those services. Again, still accompanied by the appropriate clinical care. And also the flourishing of different trackers and wearables is also part of this theme where we're empowering women to really take charge. A third area that's really exciting when we looked across the landscape is seeing really new science. So a lot of, if I'm talking about the women-specific diseases, the science there is a bit old. The way that we treat certain conditions such as endometriosis, there's been new drugs recently, but for many years we didn't have a lot of options. And the way to diagnose it even was very invasive. You had to essentially undergo a surgery. But now there's multiple companies that are developing much more patient-friendly ways to diagnose this disease, for example. And so it shows this commitment to really advancing the science of women's health so that we understand diseases better, we're able to diagnose them better, and ultimately treat patients who have unmet needs. And the last area that's very exciting is the destigmatization. So making words like vagina, sex tech, making these the less stigmatized to just talk about openly is really exciting. And I know that there's still been challenges with many companies in this space, sometimes having their advertising taken down or having to go through a lot of steps to be able to actually promote their products. But in general, there's this push, not just there's the sexual health, but also in menstrual care to make these topics less taboo so we can talk about them. I mean, how can we address the needs here if we can't talk about it? If you can't go into a boardroom or go talk to venture capitalists to fundraise, if you can't even bring up these topics. Next slide. And when we had looked across different metrics and indicators, no matter how you cut it, the interest in femtech is growing quite rapidly. So on the left side, this is a chart looking at the number of press and media articles related to the word femtech. And I can also say that from my own Google Digest, there's been just such an upshot in the past year and a half in this space. It's hard to keep up with. Of course, in the past few months, things have been different as we've had a global pandemic take over people's mind share, but at least in the pre-COVID world, it's been really exciting to see this kind of momentum build. And on the right side, this is looking at when were startups founded that we had covered in this landscaping that we looked at. And also you can see a similar trend where in the last 3-5 years, there's been a huge increase, and our data stops a couple of years ago, and I know that in the past 1 or 2 years there's been even more, which is again really exciting and speaks to the momentum that women's health has received broadly. And I should point out that people also use the word femtech in different ways. Some include medical devices, some don't. There's variations in how you define it, but no matter how you define it, there's this broader trend about increased attention to women's health, that this is a space maybe previously felt a bit neglected, but now we're seeing this surge of interest in these different indicators, and no matter what you call it, we're seeing more and more happening in women's health, which is really exciting. Next slide. One other metric that we also looked at was around funding. And so when we looked here, there's similar picture as the charts before, essentially in the last couple of years, a steady increase here as well. And when we looked at, where the trending areas, a lot of the investments and the startups themselves tend to be in specific areas like pelvic health, menstrual health. Fertility is also a space that's gaining. There's quite a bit of innovation here for how patients, men and women actually, could help take control of their own fertility. Also, maternal health and contraception were areas that we saw a lot of interest. Okay. Next slide. So where does that leave us? Female-specific diseases is kind of one area we're covering on this slide, since as I mentioned, the general diseases that affect women but differently, that area is a little bit harder to innovate in. But at least on this side of the table, we see a lot of growth and interest in the areas as mentioned: fertility, gynecology, maternal health, for example. There are still spaces that remain uncovered. So even within women's health, things like menopause care, we look at pharma, there's not a lot going on. We looked at some of these newer innovative health tech companies. There are more in the past few years now, but also compared to some of these other areas, feel like a bit of a white space. And finally, there could be an opportunity perhaps to collaborate across sectors, where there could be a large pharma player who is really leading the charge in a specific women's health area, and then we have entrepreneurs and startups also in the same space. There could be opportunity for cross-sector collaboration. Next slide. So that's a little bit of an overview of one way to define the broad space. As you can see, there's lots of sub-pockets and different industry verticals and different ways to think about it. And adjacent topics that we think about often as well is empowering women in general in health tech, since it's very much a hand in hand. A lot of the femtech companies, they are founded by women, for example, and so this is an area that we look at as well. So next slide. When we looked at data here, and this is from PitchBook directly, the share of VC deals that involve women either as sole founders or with male founders has steadily increased, over the past 10, 12 years that we've looked at, and that's very promising. But the total is still under a quarter, and so there's still some way to go. And there's many reasons that other folks, in this event today can speak to. So we see promise here in terms of the trend lines that are changing, as well as opportunity. And so long as this trend continues, then we'll be excited to see how there could be more investments in more solutions that are targeted towards women's health. And a lot of times, those who are willing to pound the table for stigmatized topics are women themselves. Okay, so next slide. And indeed, when we had done the landscaping and looked at, what are the origins of these companies and these different startups in the femtech space, we did find that 2/3 of them are at least female co-founded, which again speaks to women being more empowered and going and starting companies that then address issues that are very relevant. Next slide. And finally, want to give a shout out to the fact that there are more and more VCs that are focused on either women's health or on female entrepreneurs. This is just a snapshot of a couple news pieces that you've probably also seen over the past year. And I know that today on the attendee list, there are numerous venture capitalists that are here with us today who fall into these buckets, who are really actively looking to fund women and women's health issues, which also helps generate that momentum that we've been seeing. Great. And lastly, it would feel remiss to not address the elephant in the room. So a lot of, as with I'm sure many others, we planned this event and thought about it in pre-COVID era, where life was different, and now we are in pandemic setting. And the question, the elephant in the room is, well, what does this mean? What is the impact of COVID on women's health? And I know that will be a topic for some of the speakers later. So look forward to hearing about that. And just for now, just I would bring a couple of thoughts on what this means. Next slide. So in the short term, there's a lot of healthcare has been turned a little bit upside down and made it difficult for women, for example, to receive certain types of healthcare, which in terms of making it to appointments for contraception, prenatal care also being, for example, moved to telemedicine, et cetera. But if we just think about the longer term, because the short term changes, they will change as sheltering is lifted. But in the medium term, if we just look broader on that horizon, as a company, we did a little thinking on what does this mean for the healthcare ecosystem in general, and then we can think about what does that mean for women's health. So, number one, most obviously is really changes in coverage as people's employment status changes. And when you think about this could have impact on entrepreneurs who have products where they're counting on certain types of patient affordability or insurance coverage. And also for women themselves is how will they access the care that they need to treat the different conditions. And in terms of second factor we think about is the increased role of governments in terms of allocation of resources. Also, more patients probably being on government insurance plans and all the different implications that we might see there. I think probably the one that's most relevant and already very prominent for many femtech companies and other women's health companies is this shift from physical to digital. And I've heard of some companies having increased engagement and increase enrollment in their products in this time where people are they are looking for digital services, and if you are able to provide that and you have something that can enable remote care, then this is a really great opportunity for you to fill a gap that's being caused with the whole pandemic setting. And I'm sure that the other speakers later today will speak more to this and how specific companies are adapting or able to really reach their customers in a better way here. And lastly, with this accelerated pace of change, the broad shifts just mentioned affect everyone really. And so are you as a company able to change the way that you operate? So for example, if you're for pharma companies that are doing clinical trials and looking to innovate, are you able to adapt and be able to do it more remotely in order to continue? And on that point, we looked at earlier how women's health isn't a big part of the clinical research agenda. Then for me, there's also a question of kind of in the medium and long term, what impact this might have on further development of therapies and whatnot. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions in the last couple of minutes left.
Yeah, Alice, thank you so much. That was really insightful. Congratulations on motherhood. So this is ever relevant to you now. And I think what your talk gave a really good foundation for why we're here today, what's going on in the field, where the gaps are, and where we can go in the future. So now I'll take some questions from the audience. I see some trends emerging, so I'll try to merge some questions together. But our first question talks about how you had mentioned, destigmatizing the field. I have a personal question. Are you seeing any movement on that as the femtech field grows or as the women's health tech field grows? And from Jedediah, how do we remove that stigma from the health areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I would say if we look at the language even and how different companies are being covered, it's very exciting. A lot of times it is leading with, this company is breaking a taboo in some ways and really changing the conversation. So, there's one element of, I have a product or I have a solution to address something, but leading the charge in the conversation and actually changing the conversation, I think is really critical, again, for that destigmatization and to normalize the topic in a way that then your product can gain traction. And I should say that this is occurring with the specific startups that are out there breaking ground, and again they're with us today on this event. And also you do see it with some other bigger companies and biotechs as well that are hosting different types of advocacy events or forums and using language that helps normalize some of these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see two questions here about inequities, especially through pharmaceutical company and clinical trials. So what factors have caused pharmaceutical companies to focus less on women's health needs, and specifically with inequities like gynecological treatment, like uterine fibroids affecting Black women? Do you think there are opportunities to collaborate with pharma to make, to widen the access and widen the focus on women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in terms of what drives research agendas for products in the pharmaceutical sector, there's a lot of different factors, and one is clinical breakthroughs, and are there any new drug targets? And women's health is an area that just hasn't had a lot of new clinical research that lends itself well to drug development. So our understanding, for example, of fibroids and endometriosis is actually quite limited compared to some other disease areas where there's been a ton of research. Like in oncology, there's new targets being discovered, this idea of immuno-oncology in terms of leveraging your immune system. These are all huge breakthroughs that lends itself really well to discovering new drug targets and developing new drugs. And unfortunately, in women's health, most of the therapies are very much driven, they're hormonal treatments. Like we understand certain hormones that are in women's bodies, and we try to leverage them to treat these different diseases, but our understanding is not as it does not lend itself as well. And in general, even if we put women's health aside, in general, in the pharmaceutical sector, there's been a lot of focus in recent years on oncology and rare diseases. And that's just a bit of a general truth, irrespective of what it means for women. Of course, some of them are female-specific cancers, so that's great. And just commenting that, and that's in those spaces, there is a lot of pull that we do see.
Definitely, thank you. So we have one question. How can the role of government be effective when most of the people who make decisions are largely men? So I think that's a larger curriculum too when we look at current, a larger issue when we look at current medical curriculum. And when men tend to be leaders or investors in certain situations in the boardroom, right? So how do kind of larger institutions move forward to progress the field?
That's a great question. I wish I had a good solution, but absolutely agree that if we look at a lot of elements in healthcare, from everything from how do we understand human physiology and disease processes, to the large clinical trials that have now generated essentially guidelines for the most common conditions, such as heart attacks and how to recognize them. There is very much a male bias. I don't have a great solution. There's definitely a lot more that we need to understand. And I do see continued research that's been published in terms of looking to understand how certain diseases, for example, do affect women differently, or why there are disparities. Is it a gender issue in terms of how women are being treated, or is it a physiological sex-specific difference in any outcomes, whether it's related to pain treatment or surgical outcomes? There are more and more researchers that are looking into that. That doesn't provide an immediate solution, but at least the first step in understanding why it's happening and what we could do about it to be helpful. But this is a big question, and definitely agree that we need to address that.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next event. Alice, we really appreciate all of your insight. It's been, really great to talk to you and hear your thoughts on this.